Picture this. It's 1789, and you're sitting in the Palace of Versailles watching King Louis XVI make the most catastrophic decision in French history. He's about to call a meeting that hasn't happened in 175 years. A meeting that he thinks will solve his money problems, but will instead cost him his head and destroy his entire kingdom. The meeting is called the Estates General, and Louis XVI is summoning it for one simple reason. France is completely, utterly, irreversibly bankrupt. But here's what most people don't know about the French Revolution. It didn't start with angry peasants demanding bread. It wasn't triggered by Enlightenment philosophers preaching about liberty and equality. It wasn't even caused by Marie Antoinette's supposed arrogance. The French Revolution started in the finance ministry. It began with spreadsheets, debt calculations, and failed attempts to balance the budget. The revolution that would reshape the Western world began not with swords, but with ledger books. And the most terrifying part? The exact same financial patterns that destroyed the French monarchy are happening in countries around the world today. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with a shocking fact. In 1789, France was the wealthiest nation in Europe. Its GDP was 3 times that of Britain. It had the largest population, the most fertile farmland, and the most sophisticated manufacturing in Europe. Yet somehow, this incredibly rich country couldn't pay its bills. By 1789, France faced an annual deficit of 116.1 million livres, with half of all government revenue going just to service existing debt. Not to run the government, not to build infrastructure, not to fund the military, just to pay interest on money they had already borrowed. How does the richest country in the world end up in this situation? The answer reveals everything about how governments destroy themselves through fiscal mismanagement. The immediate cause of France's bankruptcy was simple: war. From 1756 to 1783, France fought 3 major wars that drained the royal treasury dry. First was the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. This global conflict against Britain and Prussia was a disaster for France. They lost Canada to the British, suffered humiliating military defeats, and accumulated massive war debts. But the 7 Years' War was nothing compared to what came next. In 1775, France decided to support the American colonists in their rebellion against Britain. This wasn't about helping freedom and democracy. This was about revenge against their British rivals. The American Revolution was financed almost entirely through loans rather than taxation. France spent an estimated 1.3 billion livres on the American War. To put this in perspective, that was nearly the entire French government's annual revenue. By the war's end, debt service consumed nearly half of all government revenue. France had bankrupted itself to help America gain independence. This should sound familiar to anyone paying attention to modern America, which has spent nearly $8 trillion on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, while accumulating over $37 trillion in national debt. But here's what made France's situation truly hopeless. Despite being Europe's wealthiest nation, France couldn't translate prosperity into government revenue because of a fundamentally broken tax system. French society was divided into 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy, about 1% of the population. The second estate was the nobility, another 1% of the population. The third estate was everyone else, 98% of the population. Here's the insane part. The first and second estates, who owned most of the land and wealth, were largely exempt from taxation. The third estate, which included everyone from wealthy merchants to dirt poor peasants, bore the entire tax burden. The people with the most money paid the least taxes. The people with the least money paid the most taxes. This wasn't just unfair, it was economically irrational. Tax rates varied wildly by region. Collection was inconsistent. There was no central financial administration like Britain had developed. The whole system was designed to benefit the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. The financial crisis created a revolving door of finance ministers, each trying to fix the unfixable system, each failing because the wealthy refused to pay their fair share. Anne Robert Jacques Turgot became finance minister in 1774 and tried free market reforms. He wanted to abolish regulations on grain trade, eliminate internal tariffs, and most importantly, tax the nobility. His grain deregulation backfired spectacularly. Removing market controls caused rampant speculation and the Flour War of 1775, with widespread rioting over bread prices. Opposition from the nobility and regional parlement forced Louis XVI to dismiss him in 1776. This is a perfect example of how free market policies can backfire when implemented poorly or without considering political realities. Swiss banker Jacques Necker took a completely different approach. Instead of raising taxes, he decided to finance France's participation in the American Revolution entirely through loans. Using his connections with European banks, Necker borrowed approximately 530 million livres in 4.5 years. His plan was essentially to grow France out of its debt problems through economic expansion. But Necker's most consequential act was publishing the Compte Rendu au Roi in 1781, the first public accounting of France's finances. The report claimed a surplus of 10 million livres when there was actually a deficit of 46 million. Necker excluded military expenditures and extraordinary charges to hide the true situation. The report sold over 200,000 copies, making Necker a popular hero while lying about the government's financial condition. This established the dangerous precedent that the public had a right to know about government finances, which conservative courtiers saw as undermining royal authority. Marie Antoinette and the king forced Necker's resignation in May 1781. Charles Alexandre de Calonne became finance minister in 1783 and adopted what we now call a Keynesian approach. He believed he could stimulate the economy out of crisis through increased public spending. Calonne discovered that France had debts of 110 million livres. By 1786, he found the annual deficit had reached 112 million livres, representing 34% of all government spending. Interest payments alone consumed over 40% of government expenditure. His nickname became Monsieur Déficit because of his free spending policies. In 1787, knowing the regional parliaments would reject his reforms, Calonne convinced Louis XVI to summon an assembly of notables, 144 hand-picked nobles, clergy, and magistrates. Calonne's reform package included cutting government spending, creating free trade, authorizing the sale of church property, equalizing taxes, and establishing a universal land tax affecting nobles and clergy. The assembly rejected these reforms, arguing they lacked authority to approve such changes and demanding the summoning of the Estates General. Louis XVI dismissed Calonne in April 1787. By 1788, France's financial position had become completely untenable. The government deficit was 116.1 million livres. Half of all revenue was going to debt service. They couldn't secure new loans at reasonable rates. Political gridlock prevented any tax reform. With no other options, Louis XVI made the fateful decision to summon the Estates General for the first time since 1614. This decision proved to be the monarchy's death warrant. The Estates General was supposed to be a consultative assembly that would approve new taxes. Instead, it became a constitutional crisis that destroyed the French monarchy. The structure was designed to preserve the old order. The First Estate, clergy, got about 300 deputies. The Second Estate, nobility, got about 300 deputies. The Third Estate, everyone else, got about 600 deputies representing 98% of the population. But here's where the system broke down. How would decisions be made? If they voted by estate, each estate got one vote. This meant the First and Second Estates could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1, even though they represented only 2% of the population. If they voted by head, each deputy got one vote, giving the Third Estate effective control due to their numbers. The Third Estate, frustrated by the voting procedures that would let the wealthy minority control the poor majority, took a radical step on June 17, 1789. They declared themselves the National Assembly and invited members of other estates to join them. This was revolutionary. They were claiming to represent the French nation rather than just one estate. They were asserting that political authority came from the people, not the monarchy. When Louis XVI ordered their meeting hall locked, the National Assembly gathered in a nearby tennis court and swore the tennis court oath on June 20th, 1789. They vowed not to separate and to reassemble wherever necessary until the constitution of the kingdom is established. A financial crisis had become a political revolution, but the story doesn't end there. The new revolutionary government still faced the same financial crisis that had destroyed the monarchy. Their solution was both brilliant and catastrophic. In December 1789, they created something called assignats, paper money backed by confiscated church property. The initial plan seemed elegant. Issue 400 million livres in assignats, paying 5% interest. Back them with nationalized church property worth an estimated 2 to 3 billion livres. Use the assignats to purchase the confiscated lands, removing them from circulation. This would theoretically eliminate both the deficit and the paper money. By September 1790, the assignats were transformed into legal tender for all transactions, with interest payments eliminated and an additional 800 million livres issued. Initially, the assignats worked. They provided liquidity in a money-starved economy and enabled the purchase of national lands. It appeared to solve the fiscal crisis, but political instability destroyed confidence in the new currency. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 and subsequent political chaos made people lose faith in assignats. By 1793, there were 5 billion assignats in circulation, with rising prices and food shortages. By 1794, there were 7 billion in circulation, and assignats were worth only 31% of face value. By 1795, there were 10 billion by May and 14 billion by July as hyperinflation began. By 1796, 45.5 billion assignats had been issued, and they were virtually worthless. Using economist Philip Kagan's definition of hyperinflation as 50% monthly inflation, France experienced true hyperinflation from May to December 1795. Assignats fell from 31% of face value in August 1794 to 8% by April 1795. Economic life became unpredictable as the real value of money collapsed daily. People rushed to spend increasingly worthless paper money as fast as they could get it. In 1796, the Directory attempted to replace assignats with mandats backed by gold, but public distrust of paper money was so deep that the mandats depreciated before they were even issued. The experiment lasted only until February 1797. By 1796, France had returned to metallic currency. Napoleon Bonaparte, who came to power in 1799, opposed all forms of fiat currency and established the gold franc in 1803. Total damage, 2.5 billion mandates and 45 billion assignats issued, creating the first hyperinflation in modern European history. The sequence of events shows how fiscal problems can destroy entire political systems. The financial crisis forced a complete restructuring of French government. On August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly abolished feudalism and noble tax exemptions. On August 26th, they adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. By 1791, constitutional monarchy was established with limited royal power. By 1792, the monarchy was abolished and the First French Republic proclaimed. The need for war financing led to more assignat issues and inflation. Economic hardship fueled popular radicalism. The Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794 resulted partly from economic crisis and the desperate need to finance ongoing wars. Financial pressures contributed to political extremism because the government couldn't maintain stability while managing hyperinflation and military conflicts simultaneously. The financial crisis accelerated massive social change. It led to the elimination of tax exemptions for nobility and clergy, the abolition of internal tariffs and trade barriers, and the establishment of uniform weights, measures, and currency. Most importantly, it destroyed the old social structure. Church and noble lands were transferred to bourgeois and peasant owners. Feudal obligations and seigneurial rights were eliminated. A more mobile, market-oriented society was created. The financial crisis that started in the ledger books ended with a completely transformed society. The French financial crisis reveals why some countries navigate fiscal problems successfully while others collapse. During the same period, Britain successfully financed its wars against France through a more efficient tax collection system, a developed bond market that allowed sustainable debt financing, and the Bank of England providing monetary stability. The parliamentary system allowed for necessary fiscal adjustments. The United States faced a similar post war debt crisis in the 1780s, but Alexander Hamilton's financial reforms in the 1790s successfully consolidated and funded the debt. Federal assumption of state debts created a unified fiscal system, and sound monetary policy maintained confidence in government obligations. France failed because its political system made necessary fiscal reforms impossible to implement peacefully. The patterns that destroyed the French monarchy are visible in countries around the world today. Structural inequality. Tax systems that exempt the wealthiest from paying their fair share remain economically unsustainable. When the burden falls disproportionately on middle and lower classes, fiscal crisis becomes inevitable. Political gridlock. When privileged minorities can block necessary reforms, constitutional crises develop. This is visible in countries where special interests prevent needed fiscal adjustments. Fiscal irresponsibility. Financing government operations and military adventures through debt rather than taxation merely delays and magnifies crisis. The bill always comes due eventually. War spending. Military adventures financed through borrowing rather than taxation create unsustainable debt burdens. France bankrupted itself fighting Britain and supporting American independence, just as modern nations have bankrupted themselves in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts. Loss of confidence. Once credibility is lost, even sound fiscal measures can't restore stability. When people stop trusting government promises, monetary and fiscal policy becomes ineffective. The money printing trap. Using monetary policy to solve fiscal problems typically makes the situation worse. The Assignat episode demonstrates that paper money can't solve structural fiscal problems, it only delays and amplifies the crisis. The French Revolution teaches us to watch for specific warning signs that indicate a fiscal crisis is becoming a political crisis. When debt service consumes more than 40 to 50% of government revenue, the situation becomes unsustainable. France crossed this threshold in the 1780s. When necessary fiscal reforms are blocked by political gridlock, crisis becomes inevitable. The French parlements and privileged estates could prevent tax increases, but couldn't prevent financial collapse. When governments resort to creative accounting or hidden debt to mask fiscal problems, credibility is destroyed. Necker's false accounting undermined confidence in French finances. When paper money is used to solve fiscal problems, hyperinflation often follows. The Assignat experiment shows why printing money isn't a solution to structural deficits. When political systems become too rigid to adapt to fiscal reality, revolution or collapse becomes likely. The Ancien Regime couldn't reform itself, so it was destroyed. These lessons apply directly to contemporary fiscal challenges. Countries with high debt to GDP ratios and rising interest payments face similar pressures to pre-revolutionary France. When debt service consumes too much of government revenue, fiscal flexibility disappears. Political systems that allow special interests to block necessary tax or spending reforms create the same gridlock that paralyzed France in the 1780s. Attempts to solve fiscal problems through monetary expansion rather than addressing underlying structural issues risk creating assignat-style inflation and loss of confidence. Democratic institutions that can adapt and reform have advantages over rigid systems that resist change until crisis forces catastrophic adjustments. The French Revolution began with a simple fiscal problem. The government spent more than it collected in taxes. This financial crisis became a constitutional crisis when the political system couldn't adapt to fiscal reality. The monarchy called the Estates General, hoping to raise taxes, but instead unleashed forces that destroyed the entire regime. The subsequent attempt to solve fiscal problems through paper money created the first hyperinflation in modern European history and provided a cautionary tale about the limits of monetary policy. The hidden financial crisis that sparked the French Revolution reminds us that economic policy is never merely technical. It's always about power, justice, and the fundamental question of who pays and who benefits in society. The French Revolution wasn't really about liberty, equality, and fraternity, though those ideals emerged from it. It wasn't about angry mobs demanding bread, though hunger played a role. It wasn't about Enlightenment philosophy, though those ideas provided intellectual framework. The French Revolution was about money. Specifically, it was about a government that couldn't balance its books because the wealthy refused to pay taxes, wars were financed through borrowing rather than taxation, and the political system was too rigid to allow necessary reforms. And when Louis XVI summoned the Estates General in 1789, he thought he was calling a meeting to approve new taxes. Instead, he unleashed a revolution that would destroy his kingdom, cost him his head, and reshape the Western world. The revolution that began with empty coffers ended with a transformed society, proving that fiscal crisis, when combined with political inflexibility, can topple even the most established regimes. Today's governments facing similar fiscal pressures would be wise to study the French example. The patterns that destroyed the Ancien regime haven't disappeared. They've simply moved to different countries and different centuries. The question isn't whether fiscal crises lead to political upheaval. The question is whether modern political systems are flexible enough to adapt before crisis forces catastrophic change. France in 1789 shows us what happens when they're not. Thank you for watching my Money Mint. If you have any feedback for my videos or topics you'd like me to discuss, please leave a comment below.